So along those lines, anticoagulation, let's switch gears a little bit to talk about anticoagulation, not in the setting of AFib, where it's in general full dose, may be renally adjusted if it's one of the NOACs, but the case of ACS, and if you could just briefly review the APPRAISE-2 trial and then the ATLAS-2 trial, which used anticoagulants, which tested them in acute coronary syndromes, largely on top of dual antiplatelet therapy, a little bit of aspirin monotherapy as well as background therapy.
So Deepak, I think when we think about an acute coronary syndrome, we know that at the time of that acute plaque rupture, we get intense platelet activation, hence our DAPT as the foundation and out to, as we've discussed for a year. But we also get intense thrombin generation. So early on, adding an anticoagulant with heparin or low molecular weight heparin or fondaparinux has been the standard. We've tried to extend beyond that very early phase using one of the NOACs, and there have been a series of studies now. There's a small one with the dabigatran, a larger one with the apixaban, and an even larger one with rivaroxaban. And what we've learned from these studies is that clearly there is a benefit of adding an anticoagulant to antiplatelet therapy, but it's all about hitting the sweet spot. And I think the dabigatran was only a phase 2 trial, the REDEEM trial. The results are inconclusive because it's too small. Apixaban was tested here at the standard AF dose, and the trial was stopped early because of an excess of bleeding. You could argue whether maybe they should have pushed on because there was a hint of benefit, but I suspect that the dose was a little too high.
There's some pretty bad bleeding too.
Yes.
It would have been hard to forge ahead. But
And the ATLAS trial, I think, hit close to the sweet spot. Rivaroxaban 2.5 twice a day or 5 twice a day on top of aspirin, and we're starting to see there's a reduction in ischemic events. There's a penalty to pay in terms of bleeding, but it translates into survival benefits. So to me, that's the evidence that tackling coagulation, even in this early acute phase, is beneficial.
And to be clear, in that trial, it was really the rivaroxaban 2.5 milligrams BID that was reducing the risk of cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. Ended up, though, not displacing patterns of care in the U.S. or really even elsewhere, where DAPT remained the anchor despite that positive trial. But it did serve as an impetus to the COMPASS trial, which, of course, you were one of the principal investigators of. And can you tell us about that trial, just in broad terms, the inclusion, exclusion criteria?
So COMPASS was, as you suggest, built directly on the ATLAS program. Building on that success, the same doses of rivaroxaban tested in a slightly different manner, but here in chronic coronary or peripheral artery disease. The difference was that we obviously didn't take the acute patient, and we didn't allow dual antiplatelet therapy. So we went with rivaroxaban 2.5 milligrams twice daily in combination with aspirin, or rivaroxaban 5 milligrams twice daily alone, and the control was aspirin alone. And you were leading the study in the US, and in the US the data show that most of these people are treated with aspirin alone, so that was the appropriate control group.
Yes. So that was the basic design of the study, large study, 27,000 people in total. What were the findings?
Well, the findings were actually very straightforward, very clear-cut. The trial was stopped early because that combination of therapy, rivaroxaban plus aspirin, compared with aspirin alone, prevented major adverse cardiovascular events by about 1/4, reduced by about 1/4. That was accompanied by about a 1/5 reduction in mortality. So when you see a reduction in cardiovascular events, you hope that that will translate into survival benefits, because if you're preventing bad strokes and bad MIs, you want to live longer. There was a penalty to pay in terms of bleeding, but because I think the dose was close to the sweet spot, there was no increase significantly in fatal bleeding, and so you get a very clear net benefit.
Speaking about PAD and antithrombotics and that sort of thing, anything you want to tell our audience about the Voyager trial? That's something I think even in primary care, at least they need to be aware that it's coming and what the implications might be.
Yeah, so the Voyager Pd Trial is a 6,500 patient trial where we taking what was learned with COMPASS, where it was to say, okay, we now know chronically taking patients who have atherosclerosis and thrombosis with CAD, PAD, and this variety of risk factors, this 2.5 milligram dose with aspirin twice a day really seems to be potentially beneficial. So surprisingly, without knowing that result, but thinking that dose, because of Atlas, was going to be a good one, we had started a trial to better understand after revascularization, because one of the other things is we do want to inform the people doing the endovascular procedures or the surgical procedures. And let me highlight, we've talked about endovascular, but the vascular surgeons take care of these patients who have equally high risk. And certainly these bypass grafts, whether they're veins or other conduits, have a thrombotic nature that leads again to limb harm. And so we randomized 6,500 patients to either they were getting an endovascular or surgical procedure to a baseline of aspirin by itself or aspirin plus rivaroxaban after the procedure. Now, those patients were allowed to get clopidogrel for some duration of time if it was felt needed. We'll stratify by that. That trial has completed its enrollment, is in follow-up, and hopefully by spring of 2020 we'll have some results. And so I think what that will do is take that gap between chronic therapy and acute post-revascularization for the limb and give us some information there. And hopefully, if that shows similar trends, will again help us shorten the gap from when we know something works to getting it into our patients.
Yeah, no, that's really quite informative.